It was a calm Friday evening in the city, the kind that made people slow down after a long week. The streets glowed under the soft orange lights, and the small stores along the plaza were closing one by one. Inside a parked patrol car at the corner, two young officers were finishing up their shift. They had been driving around for hours, hoping for something to break the quiet. The radio was mostly silent, except for the occasional update about a few shoplifting incidents reported in nearby stores over the past month. They were tired, but not ready to head back just yet. One of them looked out toward the parking lot of a clothing boutique and noticed a dark-colored car pull up. A woman stepped out wearing a plain coat and carrying herself with quiet confidence. She locked her car and walked into the store, her posture calm, her step steady. The officers watched her through the windshield.
One of them said, "You see that?"
Doesn't look like she's from around here. The other shrugged, but curiosity had already started working on both of them. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was just an instinct they didn't even understand themselves. They decided to keep an eye on her. The plaza wasn't busy anymore, and she was one of the few customers still walking around that late. The officers got out of the car and leaned casually against the hood, pretending to chat while their eyes stayed fixed on the boutique's glass door. Inside the store, the woman moved through the aisles quietly. She looked like someone who had spent her whole week buried in work, tired but still composed. She smiled politely at the store clerk and began browsing through the racks. She picked up a few shirts, a scarf, and a pair of gloves, examining them carefully before heading to the counter. Everything about her seemed normal, calm, unhurried, respectful. But outside, the officers were already building their own story. They saw her pause near a display shelf, then move toward another section. One of them whispered, "She's definitely looking around too much." The other nodded. "Let's just wait and see." They didn't notice the way the clerk smiled as she rang up the purchases or the way the woman handed over her credit card without hesitation. To them, she fit an idea that was already sitting in their minds. After paying, the woman left the store, carrying a small paper bag. The night breeze brushed against her face as she walked toward her car. She unlocked the door, placed her bag inside, and was about to get in when flashing red and blue lights filled the parking lot. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence. She turned around slowly, confused, as the patrol car came to a stop behind her. The same two officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. She blinked, unsure what was happening. One of them called out, "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a second?" "Of course," she said calmly. "Is there a problem?" "We received a report about a possible shoplifting incident. Would you mind showing us what's in your bag?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "I just came from that store," she said, nodding toward the boutique. "I paid for everything. You can ask the cashier." "We'll check that," one of the officers replied, his tone firm. "But for now, we just need to take a quick look." She hesitated, not because she had anything to hide, but because she was surprised by how quickly the tone had shifted. Still, she opened the bag and held it out. Inside were a few neatly folded shirts and a pair of gloves, along with a printed receipt on top. The officer barely glanced at it before asking for her ID. She reached into her purse and handed over her wallet. Inside was her driver's license and another card, her police identification. "I work with the department," she said softly. "You can verify that," but the officers barely looked at it. One of them frowned. "We've seen fake IDs before," he said under his breath. The other nodded, keeping his hand near his holster, not in threat but in routine readiness. The woman's face changed slightly, a flicker of disbelief mixed with disappointment. "I'm telling you the truth," she said. "I'm a captain in the city division. Please call the station and check." "Ma'am, we'll handle that," the officer replied. "For now, please step aside." A small group of people from nearby shops began to watch. The woman noticed their eyes, some curious, some sympathetic, others judging. She took a quiet breath. She could feel her years of training telling her to stay calm. Arguing would only make things worse. She lifted her chin slightly and said, "You're making a mistake." "We'll see about that," one of them muttered. Before she could say anything else, they told her to put her hands on the car. She hesitated, and one of them repeated the order more sharply. She did as told, feeling the cold metal of the hood beneath her palms. Her heart wasn't racing from fear, it was from disbelief. She had spent her entire career teaching younger officers to be fair, to think before they acted, to question their assumptions. And now she was the one being treated like a criminal by her own kind. As one of them began to cuff her wrists, she turned her head slightly and said quietly, "You don't even know who I am." The officer didn't respond. He was focused, following the procedure he believed was right. People in the distance took out their phones. The soft click of handcuffs echoed louder than the hum of the streetlights. The air grew heavier with every passing second. The other officer searched her small shopping bag again, checking every item, every receipt, as if proof might suddenly appear. Nothing did, of course, but by then they had already crossed the line. What had started as curiosity had turned into humiliation. When the woman spoke again, her voice was steady but cold. "You really should call your supervisor," she said. "Right now." One of them hesitated, glancing at his partner. "Maybe we should—" Before he could finish, another police car pulled into the parking lot. It was one of the senior officers from the nearby district, responding to the call about a possible shoplifting arrest. He stepped out of the car, scanning the scene. His eyes landed on the woman leaning against the car, hands cuffed, expression calm but tired. For a second he froze. His face went pale. "Wait," he said, walking closer. "What's going on here?" The younger officer spoke up quickly. "We detained a suspect who matched the description from the earlier report." The senior officer stopped him mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on the woman. "That's Captain Williams," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "What did you just do?" Silence filled the air. The two younger officers turned toward each other, their confidence draining away. "Sir, she said she was a captain, but we thought—" "You thought?" The senior officer interrupted. "You thought without checking? Take those cuffs off, now." The younger one fumbled for the keys, unlocking the cuffs with shaking hands. The woman slowly brought her wrists forward, rubbing them gently. She didn't look angry, just deeply disappointed. The kind of disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. She looked at the senior officer and nodded slightly. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I am so sorry, Captain," he replied immediately. "I know," she said, cutting him off gently. "They didn't think." The two younger officers stood speechless, unsure what to say. Their training, their instincts, their so-called experience, all of it suddenly felt hollow. They hadn't seen a criminal that night. They had seen what they wanted to see. The senior officer tried to calm the moment, but the damage was already done. The bystanders who had been recording lowered their phones, whispering to one another. The air felt heavy with shame and irony. The captain didn't yell, didn't demand apologies. She just stood there, silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "I'll see you back at the station." With that, she got into her car and drove away, leaving behind two officers who couldn't even look at each other. The sirens dimmed, the lights faded, and the sound of her car disappeared into the night. Inside the patrol car, one of the officers finally spoke. "We really messed up, didn't we?" The other nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Big time." Outside, the street returned to silence, but the night didn't feel calm anymore. It felt heavy, as if the air itself carried a lesson neither of them would ever forget. The next morning began quietly at the precinct. The smell of coffee filled the hallways as officers arrived, greeting each other and settling into their routines. But the calm didn't last long. By mid-morning, whispers had started spreading across the department. Something had happened the night before, something that no one could quite believe. Two young patrol officers had arrested one of their own captains during a so-called routine stop. At first, people thought it was a joke, but when the truth came out, the entire station fell silent. No one knew whether to laugh at the absurdity or feel embarrassed for the whole department. The captain herself had come in early that morning, dressed neatly as always. Her calmness surprised everyone. There was no sign of anger, no raised voice, just that quiet dignity she was known for. She walked straight to her office, nodded at a few colleagues on the way, and closed the door behind her. Inside, she sat down at her desk and stared at her hands for a while. The faint red marks from the handcuffs had faded overnight, but the memory hadn't. The look on those young officers' faces, the disbelief, the cold tone of their voices, it all played over and over in her mind. She had spent years training officers to act with fairness and respect. Yet last night she had been treated like a stranger, judged not by her badge but by her appearance. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. In them, in the system, and in how easily bias could creep into even the most disciplined minds. A soft knock came at the door. It was one of her longtime colleagues, an older officer who had known her for years. He stepped inside holding a cup of coffee. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I'm fine," she said. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," he said. "Everyone's talking about it." "I figured they would," she replied with a faint smile. "News travels fast in these halls." He hesitated, unsure how to continue. "Internal Affairs is already looking into it," he said. "They'll have to question you about what happened." "I expected that," she said quietly. "It's procedure." He nodded and left, leaving her alone again. She leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. The sunlight poured through the blinds, drawing stripes across her desk. Somewhere deep inside she felt torn. Part of her wanted to forget the whole thing. The other part wanted to make sure it never happened again. To anyone. Later that morning, she was called into a meeting with the chief. The two officers from the night before were already there, sitting at the far end of the table. They looked uneasy, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the floor. The room was quiet except for the sound of the chief flipping through a file. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm, but heavy. "I've reviewed the report," he said. "And I've seen the footage from the plaza." No one spoke. The chief turned his gaze to the captain. "I know this must have been humiliating," he said. "On behalf of this department, I'm sorry." She nodded. "Thank you, sir." He turned to the two young officers. "Do either of you have anything to say?" One of them swallowed hard and spoke first. "Sir, we didn't mean any disrespect. We just thought she matched the description of a suspect. We were only trying to do our job," the other officer added quickly. "It wasn't personal, sir. We were following protocol." The chief leaned forward. "Protocol?" His tone sharpened slightly. "Protocol doesn't include making assumptions based on someone's skin color or the kind of car they drive. You didn't even verify her ID before arresting her. You handcuffed your superior officer in public, and you did it without probable cause." The room fell silent again. The two officers looked smaller now, like the weight of their mistake had finally hit them. The captain spoke then, her voice steady and measured. "I don't want this to turn into punishment for punishment's sake," she said. "But this can't be ignored either. This isn't just about me. It's about what could happen to anyone else." The chief nodded. "I agree. That's why Internal Affairs will handle the investigation. You two," he said, turning to the younger officers, "will be placed on administrative leave until this is resolved." They both nodded, their eyes downcast. As the meeting ended, the captain stood up and gathered her things. One of the officers looked up and said softly, "Ma'am, we're sorry." She paused, looking at them for a moment. "I believe you," she said, "but being sorry isn't enough. Learn from this." She walked out of the room, her steps firm but calm. The hallway was quiet again, but she could feel eyes following her as she passed. Everyone had heard. Everyone knew. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home, she sat alone in her office again. The city lights glowed through the window. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from a journalist asking for a statement. Somehow the story had already reached the media. She sighed and placed the phone face down on her desk. She wasn't ready for that yet. She thought about the officers, not just the ones who had arrested her, but all the others who might have done the same in their place. She had been in their shoes once, young, eager, wanting to prove herself. But somewhere along the way, she had learned to slow down and look deeper before making judgments. That was something experience taught you, and sometimes humility did too. The next day, the news broke publicly. Local headlines read, "Police captain mistakenly arrested by her own officers." The story spread fast, faster than anyone expected. People online were shocked. Some were angry. Others called it a sign of the deeper issues that still existed within law enforcement. The captain avoided the attention as much as she could, but it was impossible to escape completely. Reporters called, colleagues whispered, and even members of the community reached out with messages of support. She appreciated their kindness, but she didn't want sympathy. What she wanted was change. A few days later, she met with the department's training division. "We need to address this," she told them. "Not with just another seminar or lecture. We need something real and something that makes people reflect." They agreed. Plans were made to review all patrol training programs, especially those dealing with bias awareness and field discretion. The captain volunteered to lead a new initiative focused on cultural understanding and community trust. Meanwhile, the two officers remained under review. They avoided most of their colleagues, feeling the sting of shame every time someone mentioned the incident. They hadn't meant to hurt anyone, but they had, and the realization weighed heavily on them. One evening, a week after the meeting, the captain ran into one of them outside the station. He looked nervous, unsure whether to speak or just keep walking. She approached him first. "How are you holding up?" she asked. He hesitated. "Honestly, not great," he admitted. "I've been thinking about that night nonstop. I keep asking myself how I didn't see what I was doing." She nodded. "It's easy to miss what's right in front of you when your mind is already made up." He looked down. "I guess I thought I was doing the right thing." "I know," she said. "But sometimes doing the right thing starts with asking the right questions." He nodded, grateful for her calmness. "I'm sorry again, Captain, really." "I know you are," she said gently. "Just make sure this never happens again. Not with anyone." That night, as she drove home, she thought about how quickly things could turn, how a moment of misjudgment could change everything. It wasn't just about her. It was about trust, about the invisible lines that still existed between people even within the same uniform. She parked outside her house, turned off the engine, and sat quietly for a while. The street was peaceful, the air cool. She looked up at the stars and thought about how many good officers she had seen come and go. Some changed for the better, some hardened by the job. This, she knew, was a moment that could define the next chapter of her career. She could let it fade away, or she could turn it into something that mattered. And deep down, she knew exactly what she was going to do. She would speak, not to defend herself, but to teach others what that night had taught her. That authority means nothing without understanding, and that real justice begins when people choose to see each other as human first. The following week was unlike anything the captain had ever experienced. The story of her wrongful arrest had become a citywide topic. It wasn't just in the papers anymore. It was all over television, radio, and social media. Reporters stood outside the precinct each morning, hoping for a statement. Commentators debated whether it was an honest mistake or a sign of something deeper. Inside the station, tension filled the air. Some officers avoided eye contact when she passed by, while others offered quiet words of support. Everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells. No one wanted to be caught saying the wrong thing. The captain, however, carried herself the same way she always had, calm, steady, professional. But inside, she was deeply reflective. Every time she looked at her badge, she thought about what it truly meant to serve with fairness. She had been wearing that badge for almost 2 decades, and never once had she imagined she would have to defend her own dignity while wearing it. One morning, she received a call from Internal Affairs. They asked her to come in for a formal interview. It was standard procedure, but she knew it would be emotionally difficult. She gathered her thoughts, straightened her uniform, and drove to headquarters. The meeting room was quiet and serious. 2 investigators sat across from her, recorders placed neatly on the table. One of them started with the usual formality. "Captain, we're here to document your statement regarding the events that occurred on Friday evening at the East Plaza shopping area." She nodded. "I understand." They asked her to describe everything in detail, from the moment she parked her car to when the senior officer arrived. She answered carefully, recalling every word, every action without exaggeration. She spoke clearly, her tone steady, her emotions controlled. When she finished, one of the investigators leaned forward. "Captain, how did you feel during the incident?" She took a breath. "I felt disappointed," she said quietly, "not just because I was wrongly detained, but because I realized how quickly assumptions can override judgment. Those officers didn't see me as a person. They saw an image their minds created, and that's the problem we need to fix." The investigator nodded slowly, scribbling notes. "Do you believe their actions were racially motivated?" She paused before answering. "I don't think they acted out of hate," she said. "But I do think they acted out of bias, a kind of unconscious prejudice that we all have to confront, especially in this profession. I've trained hundreds of officers. I've seen good ones make bad calls because they were afraid or because they didn't stop to think. It's not always about intent. Sometimes it's about awareness." The room stayed quiet for a moment after that. Her words hung in the air, heavy but honest. After the interview, she walked out of the building feeling lighter, but also more certain of what she needed to do. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was a chance to start a conversation that many avoided. That afternoon, the chief called her into his office. He looked tired, his eyes showing the weight of the week's chaos. "I've been thinking," he said. "This whole situation, as painful as it is, might be an opportunity for us to look at how we're training our people." The captain nodded. "That's exactly what I was thinking, sir." "I know you've been working on new training programs," he continued. "I want you to lead something bigger, something that goes beyond policy. We need a department-wide change. People trust you. They'll listen to you." She was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "If we're going to do this," she said, "we can't just talk about procedures. We have to talk about mindset. We have to help officers understand their own fears and biases before they go out into the field." The chief leaned back in his chair. "I agree. Write up a proposal. Let's see what we can build from this." When she left his office, she didn't feel angry or bitter anymore. She felt determined. Maybe this was why it had happened. Not as punishment, but as purpose. Over the next few days, she poured herself into her work. She stayed late at the precinct, drafting outlines, making notes, and reaching out to community leaders who could help shape the program. She wanted it to be more than just a class with slides and videos. She wanted officers to sit in a room with people they didn't know, people they might usually judge, and listen to their stories. At the same time, the 2 young officers who had arrested her remained on leave. They spent most of their days at home, thinking about what had happened. The silence was heavy for both of them. One of them had even thought about quitting, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Deep down, he wanted to make things right, somehow. One morning, he called the captain's office and asked if she would be willing to meet. She agreed. They met at a small coffee shop away from the precinct. When he walked in, he looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with his cap. She greeted him politely and invited him to sit. He hesitated before speaking. "I wanted to say I'm sorry again," he began quietly. "I know we already apologized, but I can't stop thinking about it. I keep replaying that night in my head. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now, I see how blind I was." She nodded slowly. "What did you learn from it?" she asked. He looked down. "That I was too quick to judge. I didn't even give you a chance to explain. I was so focused on proving I was doing my job that I forgot to be human first." The captain's expression softened. "That's something a lot of people forget in this line of work," she said. "We're trained to react fast, but sometimes reacting fast is the worst thing we can do. Real policing isn't just about control, it's about understanding." He listened carefully, his eyes filled with regret. "I've been thinking about bias," he said. "I didn't think I had any before, but now I realize that maybe I did, the kind that hides behind the word instinct." She smiled faintly. "That's a good start," she said. "Admitting that is the first step to changing it." They talked for over an hour. She didn't lecture him. She listened. She shared stories from her own early days in the force, the mistakes she had made, and the lessons that stayed with her. By the time they left, the air between them felt lighter. When she got back to her office later that day, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe healing didn't come from anger or punishment. Maybe it came from understanding and conversation. As weeks passed, her proposal for reform took shape. It was more than a training plan. It was a movement within the department. She called it the Perspective Program. It focused on empathy, real-life encounters, and honest dialogue between officers and community members. It wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about opening eyes. When she presented it to the chief, he read it slowly, nodding as he went through each section. When he looked up, he said, "This is good. This could really change something." The captain smiled. "That's the goal," she said. Not long after, the first trial session was held. Officers from different divisions gathered in a community center, not in uniform but in plain clothes. They sat in circles with local residents, teachers, shop owners, students, parents, people they normally only saw through their car windows. At first, the room was tense. No one knew what to say. But then stories started to come out. Stories of fear, misunderstanding, and small moments of humanity. By the end of the session, the atmosphere had changed. Some officers admitted they had never really listened to people outside the job before. Others said it made them rethink how they approached their work. When the captain stood up to speak at the end, she didn't mention her own experience. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew. She just said, "Change doesn't start in a policy book. It starts in the heart. The day we stop seeing people as people, we stop doing our job." The room was silent for a long moment. Then one by one, people began to clap. That night, as she drove home, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the kind that comes easily, but the kind that grows from struggle. The city lights blurred past her window, and for the first time since that night in the parking lot, she felt peace. She knew there was still work to do. There would always be people who didn't want change, people who would resist, but she also knew that every big shift starts small, with one story, one conversation, one brave decision to face the truth. And that was exactly what she intended to keep doing. Months passed since the night that had shaken the department. What started as a single incident had turned into a quiet but powerful wave of change. The perspective program that the captain had created was now part of regular training across several divisions. At first, many officers treated it as just another mandatory course, something to sit through and forget afterward. But over time, it began to reach people in ways no one expected. It wasn't a classroom with lectures or slides. It was a circle of voices, real stories from real people. The sessions often started stiff, with officers sitting straight, arms crossed, waiting for it to end. But then someone would share a story about being followed in a store, about being pulled over for no reason, about feeling invisible in their own city, and something in the room would shift. Officers began to listen. Some of them even shared their own fears, the fear of making a mistake, of not being trusted, of being seen as the enemy instead of the protector. The captain sat through every session, not as a superior, but as part of the circle. She listened, asked questions, and sometimes shared her own story, not to embarrass the two officers who had arrested her, but to remind everyone that judgment can happen to anyone, even within the same uniform. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs had completed its investigation. The two young officers were called back in for a final review. Their leave had been long, and they had spent most of it reflecting on what happened. When they arrived at the station, they looked nervous, almost like rookies again. The captain was there too, invited as part of the final discussion. She didn't come to demand consequences. She came to make sure the lesson stayed real. The lead investigator summarized the findings. The actions taken that night, he said, showed poor judgment and a failure to follow standard procedure. However, both officers have taken full responsibility and completed additional bias and conduct training. He looked at the captain. "Do you wish to make any statement before we conclude?" She nodded slowly. "I've already said what I needed to," she began. "But I'll say this. Mistakes happen in every job. What matters is what we do after them. These two have shown regret, and they've taken steps to change. I believe that's worth something." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the investigator announced that the officers would return to active duty, under supervision for a period. It was a fair outcome, not too light, not too harsh. As they all stood up to leave, one of the young officers turned to the captain. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up on us." She looked at him and gave a small smile. "Just make me proud," she said. "That's all I ask." That evening, when she stepped outside the precinct, the air felt cool and clean. The sunset painted the sky in soft colors. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe deeply and let go of the weight she'd been carrying. The next few weeks brought new challenges. The Perspective program had started drawing attention from neighboring departments. Some praised it as a model for reform. Others criticized it, calling it unnecessary or too soft. But the captain knew that true change never came without resistance. She had seen it before. In every major shift, there were always those who clung to old ways. One day, a reporter requested to do a feature on her work. She was hesitant at first, not wanting the story to become about her personal experience. But after some thought, she agreed, on one condition. The focus would be on the message, not the moment of her arrest. When the interview aired, it was simple and honest. The captain spoke about empathy, understanding, and the importance of self-awareness in law enforcement. "We wear the same uniform," she said, "but we don't all see the world the same way. That's why we need to listen more, not just to others, but to ourselves." The segment reached thousands of viewers. Many people from the community sent messages of appreciation. Some even volunteered to participate in future sessions. For the first time in a long time, the relationship between the department and the community began to feel less like a wall and more like a bridge. But not everyone was pleased. There were whispers among a few older officers, the kind who had seen too many reforms come and go. Some thought she was making the department look weak. One afternoon, she overheard a group talking near the break room. "She's turning this place into a therapy center," one of them muttered. Another replied, "Maybe she forgot what real policing is about." The captain didn't confront them. She just walked past, pretending not to hear. But deep down, she understood. Change made people uncomfortable, especially those who'd lived too long believing the old way was the only way. She didn't blame them. She just hoped that, one day, they would see what she was trying to do. The next week, she was invited to speak at a city leadership conference about reform and trust. It was her first time addressing such a large audience outside the department. Standing on the stage, looking out at rows of faces, officers, officials, students, and community leaders, she felt a mix of nerves and pride. When she began speaking, her voice was steady. "A few months ago," she said, "I had an experience that changed how I see my own badge. I was mistaken for someone I wasn't, and in that moment I realized how fragile trust can be, both inside and outside the uniform." She paused, letting the words settle. "But that night also taught me something else. Change doesn't come from shame, it comes from conversation. It comes from the courage to admit when we're wrong and the patience to grow from it." The audience listened in complete silence. Some nodded. Others wiped their eyes. She ended with a simple line that stayed with everyone in the room. "You can't serve people if you don't see them." After the speech, people came up to thank her. A few officers from other departments said they wanted to bring her program to their cities. It was the kind of progress she had only hoped for quietly in the beginning. Now it was happening. Slowly, but surely. Back at the precinct, the two young officers continued their work under close guidance. They had changed. They spoke differently now, slower, more thoughtful. They took time to listen during calls, to explain their actions calmly to the public. Other officers noticed the difference. Some even followed their lead. One evening, the captain ran into them while leaving the station. They had just finished their shift. One of them smiled and said, "Captain, we went to another perspective session today. It really got us thinking." She smiled. "That's good," she said. "Keep going. You're the ones who'll set the example for others." As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel proud. Not proud of herself, but proud of the change she was seeing in others. Maybe the night that had started in humiliation had turned into something greater than she ever imagined. But there were still moments when the memory came back. The flashing lights, the sound of the handcuffs, the quiet sting of disbelief. It wasn't pain anymore, but a reminder. A reminder of how easy it was for people to forget that behind every face, behind every uniform, there was a person with a story. One late night, sitting in her office, she wrote a short note in her journal, something she had started keeping after that night. Her handwriting was neat and calm. "Growth," she wrote, "is not born from comfort. It begins in discomfort, in the moments that force us to see ourselves clearly." She closed the notebook, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the window at the quiet city below. The streets glowed softly under the streetlights, and somewhere out there, new officers were starting their shifts. Some nervous, some excited, all carrying the same badge she did. She hoped they would carry something else too. A bit more patience, a bit more humility, and the courage to look beyond assumptions. The night she was arrested had been painful, yes. But it had also opened doors, not just for her but for everyone who had been too afraid to speak up about the small, invisible biases that shape decisions every day. Now, months later, she could finally see what that night truly meant. It wasn't just irony, it was transformation. It was proof that even the hardest experiences can lead to something meaningful, if someone is willing to face them with grace instead of anger, and she had done exactly that. A year had passed since the night that changed everything. The department looked different now, not just in structure but in spirit. There was something quieter, more thoughtful in the way people spoke, moved, and worked together. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. The air felt lighter. Captain could see it every morning when she walked through the front doors. The small greetings, the nods, the shared respect that had grown over time. The Perspective program had expanded far beyond what she imagined. It had started as a few sessions in one department, but now it had reached several precincts across the state. Officers from different backgrounds sat together, listening to one another's stories, realizing that empathy wasn't weakness, it was strength. She had become somewhat of a quiet figure of inspiration, though she never sought attention. People would mention her story during training sessions, how the woman leading reform had once been mistaken for a suspect, how she turned humiliation into healing. She didn't love being the center of that tale, but she understood its purpose. It reminded people that anyone could be on either side of misunderstanding. One morning, she received a letter on her desk. It wasn't official. No letterhead, no signature. Just a handwritten note folded neatly. It read, "You made me see things differently. I didn't think people like me could change. But I was wrong. Thank you." There was no name at the end. She smiled softly and tucked it into her notebook, the same one where she had written her thoughts on growth months earlier. The notebook had become her quiet companion through all of this. A few weeks later, she was invited to a community event held in the city park. It was organized by local residents and officers who had gone through her training. The goal was simple: to build trust through small moments. A cookout, open conversations, games for kids, and meet-and-greet booths with police staff. When she arrived, she saw officers laughing with families, children trying on small police hats, and older neighbors chatting with patrol officers like old friends. The sight filled her heart with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. An older man approached her near the food stand. His voice was calm, his eyes kind. "I used to be scared of calling the police," he said quietly, "but now, I don't feel that way anymore. You've done something good here." She smiled, humbled. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was all of us, the ones who were willing to listen." The man nodded and said, "Listening. That's where it all starts, isn't it?" Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, music played softly through the speakers. People clapped, laughed, and danced a little. For once, the uniforms didn't create distance. They blended into the crowd like any other person. And in that moment, the captain realized this was what she had been working toward, a moment where connection replaced suspicion. Back at the precinct, her leadership style had quietly reshaped the department's culture. New recruits were trained differently now. Instead of just memorizing laws and tactics, they were also taught emotional awareness, communication, and understanding. It wasn't a rulebook change, it was a mindset change. One afternoon, she was reviewing files in her office when she heard a knock on the door. It was one of the young officers, one of the two who had arrested her that night. He looked different now, calmer, more confident, more grounded. "Got a minute, Captain?" he asked. "Of course," she said, motioning for him to come in. He sat across from her, holding a small folder. "I wanted you to know," he said. "I applied for the community liaison position. I think I can make a difference there." She felt a quiet sense of pride. "That's good," she said. "I think you'll do well." He hesitated, then added, "I also wanted to say something else. I've thought a lot about that night. I can't change what happened, but I hope I've become someone you can trust now." The captain leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle. "You already have," she said. "What matters isn't the mistake. It's the lesson you carry from it." He nodded, visibly relieved. They spoke for a few more minutes before he left. When the door closed, she sat back and let out a soft sigh. Life had a strange way of bringing things full circle. Weeks later, the department held an internal award ceremony to honor individuals who had made meaningful contributions. It wasn't about medals or rankings. It was about integrity, service, and growth. To her surprise, she was called up as one of the honorees. The chief stood beside her and said, "Sometimes leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about showing grace when others expect anger, and patience when others demand punishment. Tonight, we honor that kind of leadership.